Now, since confession is good for the soul, or so I'm advised by experts in that area, those of us who would apply Adam Smith to the economics, to the economies as we find them now, and as they have changed since 1776, must confess that the system of corporate governance characteristic of the capitalist system that as it is developed is seriously flawed. The corporate government system has failed to give the owners of the business control of the business. We have what we call the principal agent problem, which was written about by Gardner and Means, I think in 1932 or 33. I can never remember the date. So what we get is a skewed allocation of capital as size of an enterprise becomes a goal in itself, because the prestige and compensation of the manager is a function of size. We get a situation in which the owners of the enterprise, widely scattered, can't really control the perks that managers vote themselves. And we get a situation in which it's very hard to depose directors who are really more selected by the CEOs than elected by the owners of the enterprise. Now, there are occasional revolts. So we have Prue trying mightily to overpay for AIG's Asian operation, and the shareholders, that was enough. But most of the chiseling away is not on the scale of this misadventure. So I think that we have to think about, again, when we think of something like Sarbanes-Oxley, which gets all of my free market friends very upset, we have to think about what is it that upsets us and what can minimize the role of government. For example, if government says, okay, these are the criteria for independent directors, once those criteria are met, it doesn't have to review the decisions of these independent directors. It can go home. What we have to find is ways that get the incentives right in the boardroom. And right now the incentive is to be nice to the CEO, so he will reappoint you, in effect. We have to also get compensation right, which is very, very difficult to do. But certainly Adam Smith would not reward failure, which is something that we do. Let me just cite one example that I think is rather interesting. Take Citigroup, which was essentially ruined by the management of Citigroup. They didn't have any idea how to run this operation. And so they go off into the sunset, golf clubs slung over their shoulders with 10 or 20 or $30 million bonuses. And that creates the wrong incentives. So what do we have? We then have a whole bunch of laws that are going to determine how people should be paid and whether or not they can get golden goodbyes, when instead, if we had the private sector developing compensation systems that are more reasonably related to performance, we would not have that problem. I think that, again, government has a role in aligning private and public interests. And I don't think there's any objection to that. Fifth, I'm trying to avoid getting to sixth, but I'll get there. Fifth, I'm not certain that fans of Adam Smith, who also style themselves free traders, really understand what Adam Smith said about trade. We're living in a very strange world in which there are currency manipulators, there are barriers to trade of all sorts. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote, "Commerce, which ought naturally to be among nations as among individuals, a bond of union and friendship, has become the most fertile source of discord and animosity." So he was not certain that free trade, that trade among nations, was really quite simply the same thing as trade among individuals, but writ large. Furthermore, he laid out circumstances in which a touch of, or a whiff of protectionism is not a bad idea. He was not a rigid adherent to free trade. He wrote, It is necessary at times to lay some burden upon foreign for the encouragement of domestic industry. And this is not an infant industry argument. This is when some particular sort of industry is necessary for the defense of the country, which is one thing, and when some foreign nation restrains by high duties or prohibitions the importation of some of our manufacturers. And he adds, just to make sure you get the point, revenge in this case naturally dictates retaliation. I think as we examine trade policy, we're going to find that it's going to be more and more difficult, and Smith would find it more and more difficult, to simply say we are free traders.